Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight. It's a pleasure for several reasons. I'm David Rothkopf, and I'm a visiting scholar here at the Carnegie Endowment. And for me, it's a pleasure because I'm here with friends, but also because it symbolizes finally finishing this book. I was not really sure it was done until we came to the day that we were getting it out, selling it. So that's a step forward. But it is special pleasure because to kick it off, we've got a discussion with three public servants who are among the most distinguished in their field, people who I have enormous respect for personally and after having studied them, both in terms of what they've accomplished, but also in terms of the content of their character. They're great guys, and I think they will offer to you wonderful perspectives. On the far left is General Brent Scowcroft, who has served as National Security Advisor twice, both in the Ford administration and in the administration of George H.W. Bush. Beside him is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor in the administration of Jimmy Carter. And beside him is Josh Bolten, who served in a number of capacities, including most recently as the White House Chief of Staff for George W. Bush. But all of them are more than that. All of them have been people who have thought about the issues we're here to discuss today throughout their lives, before they were in these jobs, after they were in these jobs. And they set themselves apart by people who think about the issues of the world and the issues of running the United States government as a matter of professional objectives, of professional purpose. They have worldviews, and that they are developed on a daily basis. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk for probably 40 minutes or so in a kind of a question and answer format. I've been instructed to tell those of you who are live tweeting this event, I'm tempted to say please don't, but it's unavoidable in these circumstances to use the hashtag National Insecurity, and that at the conclusion of the 40 minutes, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers, perhaps a little bit longer if there are more from you. And then we will head downstairs where there's actually reception. If anybody would like a book signed, I think I can arrange that with the author. And we will have a good time and celebrate a little bit. Now, it feels awkward for me to take a few minutes and do the talking when I'm on a stage with people like this. But they have given their consent to allow me to speak for just a few minutes about the book. I am not going to go into great depth. I just want to say I wrote a book several books ago, 4 books ago, called Running the World, the inside story of the National Security Council and the Architects of American Power, which was a history of the NSC from its inception in 1947 through to the first term of the Bush administration. And it was done in the voices of the people who served in the jobs. And it was great. I'm grateful to report a fairly successful book. And the publisher came back and said, why don't we do a follow-up? It doesn't have to be exactly a sequel. It's not directly following the structure of the book. But let's look at the period from the second term of the Bush administration through to now, because there are such strong contrasts between the way that the Bush administration has approached the world and the Obama administration has approached the world, and the evolution of the role of the White House and the role of the National Security Council has changed so much during that period and has been so central to so many issues that it would be worthwhile to take a look at it in a book. And I embraced the idea for several reasons. One was I liked writing the last book because I get to go out and talk to all of these people. In the course of this book, I spoke to 150 people, including folks like these, including 40 from outside the United States, about half and half from each administration. And that, for me, is the greatest joy of this. Because I want to say something, and it's really sort of the core of my framing remarks here, which is contrary to the conventional wisdom of Washington. Okay, it's contrary to the conventional wisdom that's offered up in the media. Of the people I've spoken to and of the people I've met in Washington since I came here 21 years ago, those who devote themselves to public service in the national security arena, in the foreign policy arena, in the military arena, are good people, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats. The partisanship that has rendered Washington dysfunctional and frozen on a variety of issues is a huge distraction when it comes to many of these issues. And while I'm not saying that there are no people who serve in these areas who are partisan, I'm saying it's important to us as citizens and as observers to strip that away, to recognize that all of these people, talented people, people with lots of options in life, come here to serve the government in the best way they know how. And they make mistakes, and they get trapped in groupthink, and they get pushed by the politics of it. But if we strip away the politics and we strip away these filters we look at, we're going to have a better chance of understanding how to make this system work at the best possible way. The other point that I want to make is that this period that we are in is a period that is different from any other period in recent history. The subtitle of the book is American Leadership in an Age of Fear. And what I mean by that is that I think that as history looks back, we are going to say that the decade or decade and a half following 9/11 and a number of other incidents that were dominant in the period, including the financial crisis, other kinds of brushes with terror and other bad actors in the world, that this period was a period in which we were back on our heels, that Americans felt vulnerable in a way that they had perhaps not felt vulnerable in many, many years, perhaps since the darkest years of the Cold War, perhaps for some since World War II. Part of this was a visceral reaction to on 9/11, the fact that everybody in the United States saw these events take place live in front of their eyes. That had never happened before a period like this. In World War II, there was Pearl Harbor, but people saw it in grainy images in a movie theater a couple weeks later, or they read about it in a paper, and their response to it was the way you respond to things that you read, intellectual, through the mind first. When you looked at 9/11 and you saw people falling from those towers and you saw the destruction, it was visceral, it was through the gut first. And America reacted for a decade through its gut. And the consequence of that was wild swings, at least in my estimation. And we overreacted in the first instance, and the signature event of that overreaction was a war in Iraq. And then, following 2008, and following the general sense among the American public that we had gone wrong to some degree, we elected somebody who said he was going to take the opposite path. And he did. Instead of overreacting to a lot of events, I think we overreacted to the overreaction. We underreacted. And certain issues were allowed to grow and fester. And the signature event of that period may also, in a tragic irony, be a war in Iraq. And so these things bookend this period. And they also suggest, as we swing from one extreme to the other, and we see the system in some dysfunction, that this may not be a period that historians look back on as a golden age in American foreign policy. I think that your general reaction to it demonstrates that that's likely to be the fact. And this is not surprising. Every time somebody gets elected president of the United States, we think this is going to be George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Abraham Lincoln. And most of the time, it's Rutherford B. Hayes. Most of the time, we get a president who is somewhere in the middle, who is a mixed bag, good at some things, bad at other things. But the beauty of the system, the reason the National Security Council system was developed in 1947 was that the people around Franklin Roosevelt said, we can't go on with this guy managing the way that he managed during the Second World War. He was playing one hand against the other. He wasn't communicating. If we were to face another war with the Soviets, we couldn't do that. We need a system that gets the best opinions, gets the best intelligence, processes it, filters it to the president in the form of choices, and then is able to implement that, and uses the whole of the United States government in a constructive way. Now, I think as we look back to the period of the past 10, 15 years, we find moments when it wasn't doing that, where small groups were making decisions via groupthink, where they were taking intelligence and misinterpreting it, or they were overreacting and they led us in the wrong direction, where small groups perhaps today are isolating the president even from parts of his own cabinet, from the full resources of the United States government, and causing problems in that respect. There were also, however, moments in this period where the system worked pretty well. And I think for some reasons we have blinders onto it. I, for full disclosure purposes, served in the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration. That's where I come from in all of this, although I try to be objective. But in the past 15 years, the time that the United States national security establishment worked the best were the last couple of years of the Bush administration, when George W. Bush recognized that things weren't going well, and he said, we've got to change the team, we've got to change the strategy, we've got to change our focus. And what came out of all of that was not only the surge, not only the light footprint techniques that the Obama administration embraced, not only a new military team that came into the thing, but other things. PEPFAR in Africa, doubling down on the Millennium Challenge, the India nuclear deal, better relations with emerging markets, a repair in relations with the allies. And then, in the second big crisis of the Bush administration, the financial crisis, there was a remarkable response, which even at the time it was controversial, but if we look back and look at how the U.S. responded versus how the Europeans responded, how other parts of the world responded, we acted quickly, we acted decisively, we nipped it in the bud, and George Bush and Barack Obama actually did a kind of remarkable partnership in handing off in the midst of this crisis and managing it in a way that wouldn't have been possible if the team in the Bush administration, the team in the Obama administration had not been willing to do that. So those are the kind of things we're looking at. Obviously, there are other things that are in the air. You have the book by Leon Panetti, you have the book by Bob Gates, you have Hillary Clinton's book, you have Vali Nasser's book. There's a lot of books right now about how this administration has worked, and we can talk about those things too. And I hope we have a good, open discussion. But I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of the overview of what national insecurity is about. The goal of the book is to look forward. The goal of the book is to say, what can we take away from that? And I think among the things we can take away are that the system, when it works right, produces not perfect results, but the best possible results. That it takes imperfect people and it makes them better. It elevates them through a sense of institutionalized collaboration that doesn't happen unless you respect the system, respect the process, and use the process. We also talk in the book, and I should say, by the way, Tara Chandra and where's Adam? Oh, there's Adam, directly in front of me, Adam Cohen, who are my researchers, did such a huge amount of work in this book that they deserve a lot of credit. When I say we, I mean, all three of us. The mistakes are all mine, but the good stuff they did an enormous amount of. But we also look at gaps going forward. We have gaps in the area of science and technology capability in the U.S. government. We have gaps in the area of certain kinds of regional expertise in dealing with a whole set of other issues. And so it's not simply a look at, through the political lens that, other people have done. It's trying to be an objective look at what works and what doesn't, and how we can learn from that so as we go forward, 2016 and beyond, we can do a better job. The best way to illustrate why a book that speaks in the mouths of the people is the best way to approach this thing is to hear from some of the people that I spoke to. And that's the objective here. Let me start with you, Brent. As you look back on the past 10 or 15 years, what sets this period apart in your mind in terms of the function of this apparatus in the U.S. national security?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, especially saying I'm on the far left. I like that. Of course, from your perspective, I'm on the far right, so have it you will. I think it's useful to go back when we're talking about different NSCs, to go back to the beginning in 1947, and what did they think they were fixing in 1947? It wasn't just that the president was going off in all directions, but there was no function of government that brought together national security. The basic elements of national security, State Department, Defense Department, intelligence, were in the government, but they were all separate, and there was nobody who brought them all together. So the original law was designed to bring together these so that the president could look at national security, not at defense over here, state over here, intelligence here, with nobody to help him. And that's how it started out. Now, in the beginning, it didn't work very well because presidents either didn't like it or, in the case of Eisenhower, he turned it partly into a military staff system. But that's what really, to me, that's what basically the NSC is supposed to do. It serves the president by bringing together all of the different perspectives that together make up national security, so that he doesn't have to do it himself without his help. On top of that, though, we have to remember that each president we have is different, a different kind of personality. They like sometimes to get their information in different ways. Just for example, the first president I served, Richard Nixon, didn't like meetings. He would rather have all of the papers and all of the views, then he'd go back to his room or his private office and study them and make a decision. His successor was just the opposite. He was not an expert in foreign policy, but he liked to hear the issues examined and explicated by his staff talking to each other. So he loved meetings. It was the way he ingested information. And you can go on and on, and each president does it a different way. And he'll do it the way he wants to do it, even though that's not the most effective way. And what the system has to do is to be able to adjust sufficiently so that he gets what he needs, which is a coordinated, consolidated input to look at. And it's different for every president. And what was some of the issues now, and the change in the nature of the international system, it's been tougher.
Well, let me ask a similar question as you look back. Using Brent's comments as kind of prefatory and sort of to lay the groundwork for how we look at the NSC. As you look back at the past 10 or 15 years, do you see a a system that's growing to meet these threats, or do you see one that's kind of spasming back and forth and searching for a right way to function, but perhaps not finding it that often?
I think a great deal depends, first of all, in addition to obviously the capacity of the president, his leadership qualities, and so forth. A great deal depends on the historical context. There's a great deal of difference when it comes to policy making when your principal rivals are, let's say, limited to only one power, bipolarity, or if there are no principal rivals because you're dominant. And the United States has gone through these phases at different stages. So that makes a lot of difference. Beyond that, it makes a great deal of difference whether the issues that you confront in the context of these two terribly important words, national security, are issues that involve complexity, difficulty of defining it, difficulty of deciding what the real choices are, or whether you are so invulnerable that you can decide on your own what needs to be done and you can impose your will on the outside world. I think the fact of the matter is that the United States has gone through these phases. And while there were different styles of presidential leadership, by and large, the historical context defined pretty much the pattern of behavior. And in recent years, we have transited very dramatically from bipolarity to American hegemony, which lasted roughly 15 years at most, to the decline of that hegemony, to the rise of complexity, and complexity of a new type in which we confront not only the residues of historical past, but the rise of new phenomena on the world scene. Something I attach a lot of importance to in my own analysis of what is happening is what I call the phenomenon of global political awakening. We had foretastes of that a little bit in the few wars that we waged since World War II, of which we only won one, and four of which we didn't win, and at best achieved a stalemate, and perhaps less than that. In the past, it was very easy to fight against weaker opponents because they were politically underdeveloped. That's how colonialism became imperialism and so successful. Today, when we fight abroad, we increasingly confront populations that are politically awakened and in different degrees of intensity are prepared to defend themselves and to oppose us. And that makes the costs for us so difficult. Who would have thought in 1945 or in 1990, for example, that dealing with a backward country in which rebellion and violence predominates, it would take a decade for the United States to achieve its minimum objectives and perhaps not even achieve them. So that, I think, affects the style of leadership. Beyond that, I think complexity forces us to deal simultaneously with many more issues. And that has a bureaucratic effect. Kennedy's national security advisor had a staff probably just a little larger than the number of deputies to the national security advisor in the present administration. Brent and I and Kissinger, I don't know about your staff, but we had staffs roughly in terms of 40, 50, take a few senior officers who are responsible for different issues in parts of the world. And today, the staff, the NSC staff writ large, is well over 300 people. That creates a bureaucracy which the National Security Advisor finds difficult to run directly. I used to make sure that my 40 people would be in touch with me every day, either personally or in writing. So when I would go home, while in the limo, I would read the daily report, which I required every one of them would write, indicating what they did, who they talked to, what problems they confront, raising issues with me that they think are important and perhaps of presidential significance. And I would write marginal notes on it so that next morning they would have that. And then I would deposit the whole book in the Secretariat's office without my notes, so that competing officers who sometimes compete over territory and access would know what the others are saying, but they would be informed. This is impossible today, absolutely impossible. So responses tend to be much more ad hoc, much more sudden, and we're confronted much more with problems that we understand less than we did at the comparable stages measured by decades backwards. Look at the rise of Islamic fanaticism. To what extent do we contribute to its rise? What does it portend? Is it likely to expand? Are we going to be bogged down more and more? Those are some of the problems that we face. And one final point. A great deal depends on presidential character. You mentioned President Nixon studying his brief. I had some occasional briefings that I had to give to President Reagan because one of the chiefs of staff thought that I was a competent briefer and it would be simplistic and it would be easier to deal with Reagan. I had the sense that he didn't read very much at all, but he had good instinct. I think that makes a lot of difference. President Obama, I have the sense, is extremely well informed. But I also have the feeling that when he meets with his top-level advisors, he tends to lay out his vision in some detail and at some length. And that already automatically predetermines the flow of the subsequent discussion with his subordinates. So all of these factors, I think, contribute to a process which today is probably sluggish in responses unless the response is required by the necessities of survival, which tends to be dispersed, which tends to be uncertain, and which avoids clear-cut decisions promptly taken, which in fact is what is very often very much needed.
Great, thank you. I do want to give you a sense of where we're going to go here. I'm going to ask now Josh a question or two, and I'll go back to each of these guys for one more quick follow-up question. So it'll take us another about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to go to all of you for questions. So if you want to think about that, think of good questions and brief questions so that we can get enough of them in. But Josh, as you listen to Spig talk about the character of presidents, and one of the issues, the character of a president, is their evolution. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was doing this book is that the first term of the Bush administration was marked by a shock to the system, a reaction to the shock, some incompatibility among some of the members of the team, some episodes of groupthink around some ideas. But, I spoke to Condi. She talked a little bit about that the first 2 or 3 years, they were just reacting. That there was no real time to sort of develop a strategy of this kind of thing. And certainly there were tensions within it. So by the time you took over as chief of staff, there was a sense that things were in trouble. And then in the first couple of years of the second term, I sensed there was an internal debate, even within the president, in which he finally came around and said, I need to make some changes. And I just want, this issue of character is so important. Can you talk a little bit about how that evolution took place in your mind?
I can, but first I want to say congratulations on a really another thoughtful and very readable book. At least the first third is.
You sound surprised.
Available on Amazon for the bargain price of.
Adam, money is vulgar. $30.
No, better on Amazon. But it's a very good study, and it gets precisely to a lot of the points that both Brent and Spig brought out so effectively, and the one you just raised about the president's character, which both of you referred to as critical, and the president's personal style. And I think evolution is the right word when applied to President George W. Bush's style. He came in with a lot of advantages, a governor, so not familiar really with the national security issues and apparatus the way many candidates or new presidents come to the office, but he also came into office having been a student of his dad's administration, which had some of the most able and most effective national security decision-making apparatus in our modern history. So he had an opportunity to watch that. So he did not come into office as a naive, but his administration was struck with really the greatest national security shock in our lifetimes, certainly in the post-war era. And as Condi said, had to respond on the fly. We were not prepared to deal with an attack on the homeland. We were in an era that, as Big just described, as sort of it was the end of history in the period when President Bush came in. And he came into office intending to be the education president, not intending to be the national security president. He was figuring and hoping that whole area would be relatively calm as it had been in the administration that you served in. And 9/11 changed all that. The world had been changing for some time, and the problems had been festering, but they exploded with 9/11, and it was a cascading series of explosions that occurred over the course of the Bush administration. So when you say evolution, that's the right word, because the first couple of years were characterized by having to make a very rapid response without an apparatus in place that was well equipped to deal with those issues, to try to build the apparatus on the fly, rebuild our military strength, and refocus it on the challenges of the day, which even the smartest people had not fully anticipated, and then learn how to deal with that as time goes on. Now, one of the interesting things in your book, at least the first half of it, is that you focus on the processes and the structures to manage what's Big correctly described as an increasingly and sometimes mind-numbingly complex set of interwoven problems. And all of that is true, but at the core of it, to address these kinds of situations, you need a leader that is able to rise above the blur of information and problems that are showing up on his desk, who has clear principles upon which he's making decisions, is able to communicate those to the people to whom he has delegated responsibility, and then when he sees things going wrong, to change direction. And that's the period in which I served. I became chief of staff I served throughout the Bush administration, but the first 2 years as deputy chief of staff for policy, the next 3 as the budget director, the most despised figure in all of Washington, except when it comes time to dole out the money to the cabinet. And then only the last 3 as the chief of staff. So I came in at the beginning as chief of staff in the beginning of 2006, and I saw a president who was struggling with a very difficult situation in Iraq, and one that he was able to eventually to elevate himself out of the blur of the noise and the happy talk and say, no, this is not going well. I need to redirect. As much as I love the people in uniform who've been beating their heads against this brick wall now for several years with flagging success, we need to change direction, even if there are many, if not most of the people in the military and the administration who disagree. So that's the president I saw operate. And I think, going back to the issue of structure, I think the structure that we had in place and remains in place is well suited for that. That it is we have a White House-centric national security structure which, Brent, I think you will agree is right, that the president needs all of those inputs. He needs all of his actors coordinated, and needs a focal point for his own top-level decision-making. And so I think the National Security Council structure was well-equipped to make the pivots that the president wanted to make when it was time to change course in Iraq, even when the Defense Department might not want to, the State Department might not want to, and the intelligence community says not a good idea.
Well, let me ask all three of you then the same question before we open it up to questions. And if we keep the answers fairly brief here, we'll have more time for the questions. But it's a tough question. And that is, let's just look at the current period. Let's look at the last year or two. In the course of that period, there have been a number of things that have taken place that have been very challenging for everybody in the national security apparatus, whether it was uprising in Egypt and deciding what side to be on in that, whether it was the problems in Syria, where the president last August looked like he was going to make a move. He then decided he wasn't going to make a move. Later on, of course, later this year, he realized he had to. The NSA scandal that took place in all of this, and how we dealt with our allies during that scandal, the move of Putin into Crimea and into Ukraine, and whether we responded to that quickly enough. And I think there's been a lot of criticism in that you hear it in the current campaign. I think you hear it, by the way, from both parties. The criticisms are that it's too White House-centric. It's a White House-centric process, but it's not using the rest of the cabinet well, that it's reactive, that it's risk-averse, and so forth. We've all heard it. One of the things that is demonstrated in the history of the Bush period was that changes are possible. This happens all the time in the system. As you said, the system is designed to be able to change. If you were going to be prescribing for President Obama for the next couple of years, what kind of changes that need to be made in order to handle better the challenges we face, what would you prescribe? I'll start with Brent, then Spig, then John.
Well, I think the one thing that is fundamentally different is the world is changing, and that calls for a different response. I first served when the Cold War was ending. The Cold War was a great discipline for it, because the strategy was given. It was containment. Now, how the tactics we argued about, but it was containment. Now, the Cold War's over, and what is the strategy? It's not clear, and another thing has happened, and that is the world is changing. And we call it globalization, but look at the information part of it. Parts of the world's population that never in history were involved in any kind of government or votes or anything are now engaged. Everybody knows basically what's happening, and they react to it. Take Egypt, for example. You know, it used to be very hard to get people to turn out into Tahrir Square. It was dangerous business. Now, all you need is a cell phone. There will be a demonstration at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you get 1 million people. It's a different sort of a world. And I think what happened on 9/11 is that there was a quick interpretation that this new world was bringing an attack on the United States, and that what we had in 9/11 was only the first attack. And there were going to be floods of attacks, and we had to do a lot of things to prepare for them. Now, it didn't happen. Now, did it not happen because we were prepared for it and dealt with it? Or was that not the nature of the attack anyway? Those are the kinds of things which affect the way the system reacts, and also whether or not it's the right way or not. I guess what I would say is the first thing you need to do fundamentally is reduce somewhat the size, because When you've got 350 people, you've got a management issue. The NSC should not be managing. It's a thought processing system. And you can't have 350 people sitting down making the policy. So the first thing you have to do is triage. What do you need to have in this small group, and what can you push back to the system to solve? That is what the National Security Advisor needs to do. What has to go through the NSC and how, and what does not have to. Be nice if everything did, of course, but the president's only one man, and that's what I would do.
Okay. It's big. Same question.
Well, I agree with much of what Ben said. It seems to me that we're now in a historical phase in which we're inevitably in a reactive mode because the world has become very dispersed, very dynamic, and the threats emanate from many sources. So in a sense, we are always forced to play catch-up in a way with events. That's one point. But the second point I'd like to make, contrary to that one, is that nonetheless, we need something that we very much lack in our sort of decision-making process, and that is some organized effort at strategic planning. This thing which strikes me always the most is that we have in the Defense Department instrumentalities which engage in planning, but of course they're focused on warfare. What kind of war, when, how, and under what circumstances. We have in the State Department policy planning, which of course emphasizes diplomacy as the technique and peacemaking as the eventual outcome. We have some degree of planning in the CIA in the sense that it tries to anticipate the shape of the world some years ahead and feeds that into the policy-making process. But curiously enough, we don't have in the White House, the center of the government, where the decisions finally have to be made, any organized, really, central planning, strategic planning organ. And I have, for a number of years, been trying to advocate the creation of something like that. At one stage, when I was in that position, I did have Samuel Huntington spend 2 years, leave Harvard, and to sort of engage in strategic planning, trying to anticipate how the world might change and how we may then have to react or respond or whatever. I think something like that is needed, and that might force at least some of the discourse on the White House level into a discourse that is more strategic in its own essence, in part because it feeds strategic planning into even a response to a challenge. But beyond that, perhaps it leads to anticipation of certain events and therefore to action by us that is preemptive. Right now, we're mostly playing up catch-up ball in different parts of the world, and others are setting the pace for us, in part because others have now foci. They're not world powers. They're semi-world powers. They're regional powers. And I think some comprehensive instrument close to the president, subordinated to the National Security Advisor and, of course, cooperative with the other planning agencies of the government would make sense. And my final point, I would try to draw into that on an informal basis through simply kind of social connection, evening discussions, perhaps led by the president with congressional leaders. Because it seems to me strategic planning and policy making cannot be divorced from Congress, given the nature of our political system. And I think that would enhance the probability that foreign policy can be bipartisan. Because if we don't have bipartisanship in foreign policy is vulnerable if one party is not totally preeminent. And our system, more often than not, produces something near balance, with a few traitors here or there being able to alter the political balance in any case and paralyze the system.
I just, in my objective moderator's role, I do want to point out one thing here. One of the central points that Spig was making there was that the government is better off when it has in the middle of it somebody like Samuel Huntington, who was the founding editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And that when you listen to the editor...
So there's a success already.
Yes, exactly. Is when you listen to the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, things go better. I'm sure you wouldn't dispute that.
Oh, no.
No, okay, so no. What would you...
I would take the opportunity to hold up the book again. These are excellent points here. I like Brent's notion of making the national security staff smaller, but perhaps even more important than that, to achieve Zbig's objective of strategic planning, even if there's no such entity right now that does that, is you need a national security advisor who sets that as a priority, not the management of the 1,000 problems that are going on every day. And in a way, Brent's idea of making the NSC smaller would help, which is shed the stuff that isn't absolutely critical to the presidency and to the country, and just trust the Defense Department and the State Department. They'll mess up, but they probably won't do a whole lot better with the White House's 10% intervention, and let them handle those things. Deal with the important stuff at the White House. These two guys did that. The national security advisors with whom I worked did that very effectively. Two brilliant advisors in Condi Rice and Steve Hadley. Now, for the Obama administration, I tremble to give advice, because having been there, I know how difficult the situation is, and people on the outside are always giving advice that's usually at best useless. So but I'll hazard a couple of things. One is that, and this comes out well in your book, David, is that I think this administration has defined itself far too much on being not the previous administration. Now, I happen to think being the previous administration is not a bad thing to be. But regardless of how you feel about that, each presidency, each administration needs its own focus, its own strategic priorities, and it can't be a strategic priority to be not like the other guy. And I think that's led us into a lot of difficulties and problems. The other is turn down the politics a bit. Every administration is very political, including the one in which I served. It's actually one of the charms of our system. It works pretty well, but it's not supposed to bleed into the national security realm, and it typically does not. And I don't think it's bled badly into the Obama administration's national security realm. But I'll give you one example of a contrast where I think the Obama administration suffers by comparison, and that is that President Bush would never allow the folks who were his political advisors even to come to National Security Council meetings, much less speak up at them. He would have a conversation with his political people, that's always important, but he would decide first what was in the national security interest of the United States, and then talk to the political people and say, can we get support for this? How do we do this? Decide first what's right and what's in the national security interest. People on both sides of the aisle, this national security community, of which I'm only an adjunct member, is actually very nonpartisan. Folks are really trying hard to support each other. And I think the White House sends the wrong signal when it gives the impression, sometimes even the misimpression, that important national security decisions are being made with a heavy political calculus.
Okay, a good place to open this up to conversation. There are people with microphones someplace in the room, so if you could just bring one over to this gentleman here whose hand is up. I would ask you to identify yourself and ask a question. And if you give a speech, then I'll move to the next person. Yes.
Okay, my name is Stephen Shore. I think everyone agrees that strategy is cool, but isn't strategy ultimately at odds with shifting winds of public opinion?
Which
Can I go
Please.
first on that? Because it's a follow-on from my previous answer. No.
That is folks. That's the prototype. Quick question. Quick answer. Back to this gentleman here, and then we'll come up to you.
Mike Nelson with Georgetown University. I had a chance to work in the Clinton administration on technology and economic issues, but many of them were international, so I spent a lot of time with both the NEC and the NSC. I was very glad in your book to see you mention the need for more work on science and tech issues and how they influence national security. I'd like to know if you have any specific suggestions, if anybody on the panel has specific suggestions on how technology, economic, and security issues can be brought together more, because we don't see that very well. And is any other country doing that better than we do?
Well, let me say one thing and then turn it to you folks. You know, I talk to a lot of people in the science and tech side, and they can be very loyal people in the administration, but they were very frustrated by the fact that they were not consulted. I spoke to one person at an undersecretary level with a critical job who saw the cyber strategy the day it was released from the White House. So better coordination is one thing. But I think that at a more important level, we have a government of lawyers. Okay, you know, we have a government of people who don't necessarily get trained and understand these issues. Some other governments, Chinese government has a government full of engineers. Other governments actually have governments full of engineers. I'm not saying that we need to switch over and that, you know, we need to have the White House full of geeks. But what I do think we need is to have people who recognize the centrality to almost everything that we're going to do, of changing information paradigms, of changing impacts of biotech and biosciences to the way societies work and how long people live and what costs what. And frankly, I think we need more capability at the center on these things. There is an Office of Science and Technology Policy. It is often a speechwriting shop. And it can't be a speechwriting shop. You need a president's science advisor who is an active advisor in this process. But perhaps, Brent, do you have a...
Well, I think these are some of the questions that need to be dealt with, and we frankly don't know how to do it because they're difficult problems. You know, I actually set up in my last stint a small group called Long Range Planning. It didn't work. It really didn't work, and I didn't have time to figure out how to make it more useful. But that's one of the problems. How do you deal with these things? Take the cyber issue, which infects the whole country. How do you deal with it? There are various ways to do it. Every way has advantages. Every way has disadvantages. And figuring it out, you're either lucky or unlucky. And nobody's figured out the magic way to run a country, a democracy. And that's part of what we're dealing with. We try this, it doesn't work too well. We try this, it's too much of this. That's what we have to do, and we've been doing it ever since 1947 in the NSC system.
So I guess the point is we need to continue to evolve here. Let's get a question right here. Okay, first.
Hello, my name is Samira Daniels. I was really intrigued with your raising Samuel Huntington's name because it's. I've been reviewing Samuel Huntington's work just more recently, and I think that what you raise is points to what I see. I attend a lot of forums, and what I see lacking is this kind of conceptual and critical kind of discussions that would go on in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And perhaps it can be characterized as
the question.
Intellectual renaissance. And I'm wondering why there isn't a Samuel Huntington. I mean, you're the closest thing to it, but what has changed? Why don't we have someone?
She was pointing at Zbig, not you.
Yeah, that's why I'm moving away.
So that's my question. I mean, what do we need to do to do that?
Well, in a way, strategizing or policy making is a kind of intermediate point between real expertise in depth, particularly the kind of novel problems that are arising, to which Brent referred to, cyber and science and so forth, and public ignorance. It's the intermediate point, because our public is uniquely uninformed about the world. It has no understanding of world history and how history changes people as people discover their own history and redefine it. Has no understanding of events that transpired in the world that affected peoples that harbor prejudices and resentments and then translate them into political reality. Have no understanding of geography. And that's a stunning fact. We don't teach geography practically in our schools. And then at the other extreme of our society are experts, people who are innovative, creative, thoughtful, and deep, but who communicate in a fashion that is self-contained. And what is in between is the political process that tries to find some sort of middle road and translate certain necessities into something that will be appealing and compelling to the masses, thereby sometimes dramatizing and oversimplifying the phenomena. And that is the role, in a sense, of the president and the staff around him. But to perform that role, you have to be sensitive simultaneously to the new frontiers of knowledge and of their complexities and of one's own limits of understanding them. And on the other hand, the latent prejudices and the residual prejudices of a society that feels for the first time in its history to be frightened by the possibility of outside attack in a variety of ways in our own society, that it's increasingly susceptible to panics. Just think of Ebola, and then just think if it became attractive to someone abroad to deliberately spread it in our society. It's not impossible to do that. So we have a situation in which, in a sense, policy decisions and strategizing is part of a complex process of compromises and adjustments in which there is no good, clear-cut solution. And the problem is, how do we then, in that context, decide how power is allocated within that narrow middle group? For example, is every president truly interested in foreign affairs? Does every president come to power really knowing the world? On the other hand, is there a risk that the president will become so absorbed in foreign affairs that he badly neglects domestic issues? How does he strike the compromise within himself? What I'm trying to say is that it's very easy for me to be sitting here and talking about strategizing without taking into account how complex and difficult the process that is, and how difficult it is to translate that idea into something ongoing that then results in the State Department and Defense Department, but also the domestic agencies working in some concerted fashion. Not to mention Congress, which essentially thrives on negativism and intervention, not to mention the fact that it's also increasingly susceptible to corrupt practices acts, namely fundraising. This is a pet resentment of mine, but I was looking at the last elections, and I made the mistake of making a donation early in July to somebody, and ever since then, my email has been swamped by hundreds and hundreds of increasingly threatening demands that I do more, or pitiful appeals, signed by name, by the highest dignitaries of our country. So we're dealing here with a very difficult and complex process. It's very easy to verbalize it in terms of a solution, but in fact, it's an endless quest which will never produce something that's ideal.
Let me add one thing to that, and I'm going to take one more question, and I'm going to encourage somebody in the far back. There's a woman back there, so give her the microphone in the far back row. But let me say one thing before you begin your question. You know, there are other things that contribute to this strategy void, and part of it's the culture of Washington right now. You know, you can't get confirmed as an official in a highly politicized Congress if you've expressed views that are outside the box. So people tend not to do it. It tends to be, you know, you look at learned publications, or you look at speeches, or you look at think tanks, and a lot of things that are produced are incremental. because people are afraid of straying outside the line and someday having that come up in a confirmation hearing and being voted out. But there is also, a kind of pee-wee football quality to the debate in Washington. And one of the things that my great staff here did was we looked at the top 10 think tanks in Washington, which have a responsibility for doing this, for 10 years. And we looked at what there were studies and events and so forth on. And what you see is a few areas of the world, and you know which they are, getting the vast majority of this discussion. A number of areas of the world, also very important, not getting any of the discussion. And the area that had the fewest number, by far, by orders of magnitude, of events and discussions around it could broadly be categorized science and technology. So, in other words, there weren't discussions in advance on these cyber issues, on these other kind of issues. And these are, and I've been affiliated with Carnegie now for, the better part of 17, 18 years. It's a wonderful place, and there's a lot of good work going on in places like Carnegie and Brookings next door and so forth. But we are not covering the waterfront intellectually. We are not being bold enough intellectually. And creativity is being dampened within the system because of the pernicious nature of the political debate within Washington. And that is also dangerous and contributes to this as well. Okay, Zbig has to go at 6, and it's 6. So are you going to leave right now?
Yeah, I really.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Zbig.
Thank you. You were very good. Excellent.
Thank you. And let's have one last question from the back, and then we'll wrap it up. So go ahead. Quick question, quick answer.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. This is actually a question based on something that Mr. Brzezinski brought up.
Can you hold the microphone closer to your mouth? We can't hear you. Just hold it right up to your mouth.
There we go. All right. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. This is based off of something that Mr. Brzezinski raised and a discussion that's very prevalent in this town right now, which is decline in American power. That we've moved into, yes, an era of uncertainty. The conflicts between superpower nations are more complex, and the role of non-state actors is increasingly complex. So I guess the big question that's floating around in this town that I'd like to pose to the panel is where does United States leadership go in this new presumably new period of history?
Turn to each of you briefly.
I'm not sure
Brent.
I heard it.
The question is, where is U.S. leadership going? Is there a leadership void? Is U.S. leadership irreversibly shrinking? Or, how do we lead going forward in this kind of multipolar environment?
Well, that's why we have presidents. But, there is no right answer. We talk about strategizing. Well, strategy is a means to reach the end. We don't know what the end is right now. Is the United States neglecting its world responsibilities? What are they? And why are they? And what's the cost? We're living in a world which is transforming from the fairly neat world, relatively speaking, of the Cold War, subject to new technologies which are changing everything. The internet, for example, was started just as a way for scientists to communicate with each other. Absolutely open. Wanted it to be open. Now one of the dangers is that it is open. And people are using it for nefarious ends. This is not we're not discussing a problem which can be solved, because you react to one sort of gulf in your planning process and another one opens up, or the world changes. We need to keep trying, but we need, first of all, to avoid disaster. And that is becoming an increasingly difficult problem because the world is increasingly a world we've not seen before. And we have to initiate our responses. That takes a condition which doesn't exist in this country right now, which is a unified system to get forward. The problems are big enough, let's look at them together. The executive and the legislative branch don't look at anything together right now. That's the nature of the problem.
Josh, last word.
I endorse especially the first part of what Brent just said, which is this is why we have presidents. This is where presidential leadership comes in. The world is indeed an increasingly complicated and difficult to manage place, substantially more so even today than it was 5 years ago when I left my service in the White House. So I have a great deal of sympathy and empathy for the people in the White House trying to manage it now. But that doesn't mean we need less presidential or American leadership. It means we need more. And if I can expand on the answer to this gentleman's question, which I hope you didn't find discourteous, I was trying to keep within David's strictures.
Thank you. Blame it on me.
But presidential leadership in these circumstances is crucial. As Big correctly pointed out that you need to cultivate the people in Congress, but you need to cultivate them so that they're supporting when you lead them, not so that you can diffuse the responsibility for making decisions in the national security area. That belongs to the president. I believe President Obama failed that test on the way he has handled and specifically handled the Syria situation. And I think that's something that that the president urgently needs to reverse in the last 2 years of his term, which is exercise strong presidential American leadership, both domestically and in the world. You may be less popular if you do it, but you will ultimately be much more successful.
Thank you. I think the final point on this is that we can talk about national security processes, we can talk about policies, we can talk about the politics of it all, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. It comes down to who's in the jobs, and the most important job and the most important person in our system is the president. Even within the National Security Act of 1947, the structure of the NSC and how it works is largely up to the prerogative of the president. How it is used, who is empowered, who is in, who is out of the room, who is involved in the message, what the process is going to be, whether the process is going to be respected. That is all a consequence of the president. 5 out of 6 of the last presidents of the United States have come to office with almost no foreign policy experience. We don't value management experience in Washington. The common misconception in Washington is that if you can articulate an idea, you can get something done. That's just not true. The United States government is the largest, most complex organization on the planet Earth. If you don't have people who are capable of managing, who understand that the core idea of management is empowering the people that work for you, as opposed to gaining your power from them or telling them what to do or using them to advance your particular goals, you are going to waste that system. So you need a president who knows where to go. You need a president who knows how to manage. You need a president who knows how to work with his people and with other leaders. And you need a president who is going to be open to other ideas and to the idea of evolution, and that he may actually be wrong from time to time. Or, in a more enlightened future, that she may actually be wrong at some points. So I think we've had a great discussion here, but this discussion can continue. Downstairs, they've laid on a really nice cocktail reception to which you are all invited. But before you go downstairs, would you please take a moment and joining these two wonderful guys for thanking them for joining us. Thank you very, very much.